This episode is brought to you by Companion. Iris and Josh seem like the perfect match, but when a weekend getaway turns into a nightmare, Iris realizes that things aren't as perfect as they appear. From the creators of Barbarian and the studio that brought you The Notebook comes a twisted tale of modern romance and the sweet satisfaction of revenge. Companion, only in theaters January 31st. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
We are
Cultivate.
Cultivate.
We are Cultivate.
Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Crime, where we discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear. I'm your host, Lindsay Valenti, and joining me today is not my sister and co-host, but instead a special guest, Michael C. Anderson. Michael writes an ancient history blog and political discussion blog. His areas of expertise include ancient history, American colonial period, United States after 1870, political morality, the history of political systems and governments. He holds a PhD in information science from Case Western Reserve University. And his most recent work, America's Counterfeit Democracy, Rule of the Power Elite, was published on September 2nd, 2024 by Sims Books Publishing Corporation. In this politically charged era, Michael delves into how the political rights of the public have been sidelined in pursuit of elite goals. He outlines how affluent families, in collaboration with major corporations, have bolstered their grip on the federal government, displayed authoritarian tendencies, and utilized their media influence to foster political oppression. Nowadays, the elites rely on the major media conglomerates to sway government actions. Furthermore, the right to vote has been eroded by the elites' control over candidate selection and funding. He's also authored 4 previous books: Twilight of the American Experiment, Without Moral Balance, Our Republic Will Fall, The Conservative Gene, How Genetics Shape the Complex Morality of Conservatives, Tribalism, The Curse of 21st Century America, and The Progressive Gene, How Genetics Influences the Morality of the Left. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited that you reached out. So, obviously, you've been writing about politics since 2005. As a historian, kind of what drew you specifically to the history of politics?
Well, I've always liked history, first of all, ever since I was in high school. I'm a conservative by DNA, so I appreciate traditions, and understanding history is a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like history tells us what's going to happen next, because almost everything that happens today has already happened one or multiple times in history.
Yep.
I started a blog, as you mentioned, in 2008 that was about ancient history. And I got into that because I was curious about, how the level of sophistication of the ancient civilizations, particularly Rome and Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Most people think that they were something between cavemen and barbarians who
Yeah.
had a very low level of sophistication. That's not really true. So I started my blog to educate the public. And if you're going to write about ancient history, you're going to write about ancient political systems. And that just got me interested in political systems in general. And then I read a book in 2012 called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if have you heard of that book?
Yep.
Okay. And so that, I always had a question about why are the right and the right and left can't get along, why are they different?
Mm-hmm.
And he really answered that by describing a biological basis for the differences between the two. And so that got me interested in educating people about it and writing about it. And so that's why I started my book sequence. The first book, The Progressive Gene, is about obviously how the left thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to write the companion book to it, but tribalism was out of control in 2018, basically. And so I just wrote the tribalism book in between and then went back to the conservative gene afterwards. Basically, I publish one every other year.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth book is about the imbalance in the institutions in the United States in balance to the left, namely academia and the media being leaning left, and there not being an equal broadcast of information to the right as opposed to the left. It's biased basically.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to remove that bias. It needs to be better balanced because it's not good.
Yeah.
And then the fifth book, this is kind of changing gears for me. The fifth book is about the billionaire influence over our society,
Mm-hmm.
which is not really a right left thing. And tribalism does have an impact here, though, because as long as the public is tribal, we can't join forces to take on the billionaires. They could just sit and laugh and watch while we beat each other up, and they just make more money.
Yep.
So we need to fix tribalism, and we need to understand as a country that because of left right differences, we need consensus. And
Mm-hmm.
each side has to agree to work with the other side to move the government and the society forward. There
Yep.
can't be polarization, serves no purpose. We're all living through the ideological behavior of the extreme right and left who have the megaphone,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest of us just sit and watch them argue about ideology, which serves no practical purpose.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned a couple times the idea of tribalism. Can you explain to our listeners kind of what that means?
Well, everybody knows what an Indian tribe is, right?
Yep.
So that's kind of the way to look at it. Human beings, mankind lived in tribes, bands, and tribes prehistorically,
Mm-hmm.
way back when man first developed as Homo sapiens, and even in the hominids before that. Man is designed to live in small social groups, basically extended families, generally 50 to 100 people.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the hunter gatherer behavior that has lasted, a million years or something before Homo sapiens even came along. Because human beings have a omnivore diet tendency, so they have to hunt for food, and they have to learn what to eat also
Mm-hmm.
because it's variable. And so these bands or small tribes were organized in a way that so that they could hunt for food. They were nomadic, moving from place to place, and they were tribal, although tribal really means egalitarian because in the ancient bands, there was no hierarchy. There was no class system,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, because the groups were too small.
Yep.
So decisions were usually made by consensus, or if the interested parties couldn't reach consensus, then the tribal leader made a decision for the group. So it was a very flat organization. Obviously, the big change there was when agriculture began, the advent of agriculture, that allowed man to produce food in a small space, which then allowed human groups to grow in size from 50 to 100 to a million, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it wasn't a million then, although Rome at its height had a million residents. And when population density increased, then you need governments because there has to be a government to control the population. And governments then became class based because of kind of the winners and losers operation, like Darwinian,
Mm-hmm.
because people who were either strong, smart, or sly could move up, and those that didn't have those characteristics couldn't. And then we jump forward to, and I hope I'm not going too long with this, but
No,
we'll
you're
jump
good.
to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, the thing that's important about the Enlightenment is it created political parties, because the Enlightenment, for the first time, identified the value of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And because individuals were given value versus the group, then individuals demanded rights, and the governments were willing to extend rights to people. And those rights, what came along with those rights was political factions and then political parties, because there were politicians who represented groups with different views.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as we've had political parties, which is really only 200 years, there's been a battle between the parties, and the battle in the United States got stronger and got more severe after probably the 1990s. And the main reason for that is, and there's a whole bunch of reasons, but the main reason is the difference between right and left again. The left is more aggressive than the right. The people on the right tend to be status quo oriented and they favor traditions. I mean, everybody can see that. People on the left are change driven and they want change, and they're also very focused on equality. They
Mm-hmm.
believe that the role of government is to protect groups. Republicans believe the role of government is to protect individuals. So there's a very different philosophy among the two groups.
Okay.
And obviously, you have people on the left and people on the right, and there are people in the middle. The independents don't have an ideology, really. They have ideas and beliefs that cover both sides. So it's a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And the farther you get to the edges on each side, the more radical the ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So when the left pushes too hard on the right reacts. The right doesn't like to do battle. They just want to live their own lives and just leave us alone and we'll succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But when the attack is too strong, then they're going to react back. And so, like, we're in at least the third iteration of culture wars now. And the right does not, I mean, the right is okay with change, but they're not okay with change that happens too fast.
Sure.
And the right believes that traditions have value because they are the building blocks for the future.
Okay.
So, and the great counterexample to that is the French Revolution, because what the French did is they threw out all their traditions. They destroyed their church. They destroyed the ability. They destroyed the monarchy. They destroyed everything. And when you have nothing, then there's nothing to work with. There's no standard. There's no way to start.
Okay.
And it took France 80 years after the revolution to become a stable government system
Mm-hmm.
just for that reason. So, Republicans would say, we can accept change. We want it to be at a certain pace because when it gets out of control, then the consequences aren't known.
Mm-hmm.
And so the basic problem with tribalism is the extreme views that the left and right have taken and divided the country. All the people in Congress that used to be in the middle who were deal makers all left, and the only
Mm-hmm.
ones left now are the ideologues on the right and left. So
Gotcha.
that's the basic problem.
So to kind of piggyback off of your most recent book, in your opinion, do you feel that elites control the federal government?
Yes. It's more obvious now that maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, think about the fact that, and it's really, I mean, what I talk about in the book is there are wealthy families. And
Mm-hmm.
if you look at, I think the top 400 families in the United States in terms of wealth control like 60% of the wealth or something, like
Yep.
the Walton family, for example. So through either the ownership of corporations or presence on the board of directors of corporations or shareholders of corporations, they have major control over corporations. Now, all of the media in this country, the major news media, I'll talk about the traditional media, is owned by 7 corporations. And you could, Comcast, Disney, all those. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So everything we hear through the media, other than social media, which has another group of owners, but
Yep.
everything we hear is colored by the corporate interest and not about our interests.
Mm-hmm.
So we hear what they say or what they want us to hear,
Mm-hmm.
and they have 2 points of view they express through the media. One is they're good, not bad, and the
Mm-hmm.
other is everything is okay in America, don't worry about it.
Yep.
So that those are the standard stories. So their impact is, in general, first of all, control of corporations. Second of all, control of the federal government. Because if you look at the executive branch and you look at the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of State and all those positions, those are not billionaires, but elites in those positions. You look at their resumes, they went to a prep school, they attended an Ivy League school, they probably worked, maybe a lawyer, they worked in a corporation, they may have been a consultant that worked at a think tank or been in politics. It's like, they're all the same.
Yep.
And so they're acting to the benefit of the elites that are their taskmasters. Now, one interesting thing about the elites is both parties are there. So you may wonder, well, how can that work? Because don't the elites fight with each other? And the answer is no, because they have a common purpose. Their common purpose is not to serve their party, their common purpose is to increase their wealth, plus keep the American society stable so their wealth is protected.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't really care, to be honest, for the most part, which party wins. They're okay with, well, you win this time, we'll win next time, whatever.
Yep.
Because the candidates represent the people, but they don't have much influence over what the government does. I have a study in my book where somebody did a correlation between various groups and the likelihood of getting legislation passed that is an interest of that group. If you're a member of the elites, then there's I think it's 76 or 77% chance that your legislation will pass if you're an elite. If you
Gotcha.
are a influencer, if you are a lobbyist or influencer of elites, it's like 50%. If you're
Okay.
the public, it's like 15%. So the public has very little impact on the laws and government actions that influence us all. Now, I got to qualify that a little bit because there are things that the public's interested in that the elites are also interested in. So we ride along those things and they pass those and that benefits us. But
Mm-hmm.
they're resistant to anything that costs them money. For example,
Sure.
they don't like unions because unions to them cost money. So they're always
Sure.
trying to keep unions down. That's just one example. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the other thing I talk about in the book that's worth mentioning is there's something called a mass society. I don't know if you ever heard that term, but the way a democracy is supposed to work, I should say, and
Mm-hmm.
ours used to work this way, but it doesn't anymore. There's supposed to be an intermediate set of intermediate institutions in between the public and the government. So, like, for example, you could take the United Way as an example. At one point, the United Way was local, and the
Okay.
United Way collected donations and did good works for the locality, but they also represented their constituency to the government.
Sure.
So the United Way would go to our representative or our senator and communicate the public's wishes, blah, blah, blah. That layer of institutions is gone because organizations like the United Way became national and they're now huge organizations with billionaire influenced wealthy executives running them who are basically elites.
Sure.
So the communication from the public up to the government has disappeared and there's nothing between the government and us except the media that they control, so they control what we hear.
Sure.
So, a mass society is a society that is subject to the influence of elites, but has no communication channel upward. They lose their influence, and so it's a one sided communication channel. So,
Sure.
in our society today, and I mean, to use Trump as an example, Trump exists because the American people did not like the fact that government is not doing anything. They're not doing anything for the people.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, the Democratic Party abandoned the lower middle class in favor of Silicon Valley. So there was this very large constituency that had no representation, and
Mm-hmm.
Trump appeared and said he would represent them. That's where MAGA came from. So populists occur when government is ineffective. They're a canary in the coal mine signal,
Yep.
as are third parties because those are danger signs that something's wrong. So Trump exists because of the problems in the society, and so, and I don't know where I was going with that, but I mean it was a demonstration of the ineffectiveness of government,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's where we are today.
Mm-hmm. In regards to is the concept of elites running the government something that's unique to the United States, or is this something that we've kind of seen throughout the rest of history as well?
All through history. The Roman Republic, when it started, was run by the patricians, and the plebeians had no rights. And they fought for rights over 2 or 3 centuries, and they were granted rights gradually until they were equal to patricians. They still weren't rich; they weren't the rich people, but they had power in
Mm-hmm.
government. So it's mankind's behavior to become a hierarchy based on talent. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to be wealth. It can be based on military talent. If you're the best general, you can form an army like in the Roman Empire. Once the Republic fell and Caesar became the first dictator, after that, the Roman Empire was controlled by the army.
Mm-hmm.
And you could take, I'm sure back in the prehistoric days with groups of 100 people, there were the leaders were the smartest people, or they
Mm-hmm.
had the best ideas or something.
Mm-hmm.
And others just went along. They were happy not being leaders, and they did what they were told, basically.
Yep.
So human beings have always lived in a hierarchy, and again, not in a tribal sense. There was no hierarchy in the egalitarian society, but once government started, hierarchies came into being in government.
In your book, you describe kind of the difference and kind of the natural progression of how government has gone from, like your monarchies and your.
Well, republics and authoritarian aristocracies, authoritarian systems, everything in prehistoric time was basically aristocracies or monarchies, except Greece and Rome. They were these shining examples of people's rights that were odd. I mean, it's hard to imagine, where they came from.
Mhm.
Those particular societies had a point of view that was unique in ancient history, and it's unexplainable.
Our democracy was supposed to kind of piggyback off of the Greek and Roman model, correct? So, how do you think America and America's democracy today, how far has it shifted, do you think?
A lot.
Yeah.
The founders rejected Greece because in Greece, in the assembly, which is like the House of Representatives, the people were the ones that voted. And like Madison wrote about how that would be impossible in our society because America was too big.
Mhm.
So they used the Roman Republic as their model. Most of the founders could speak Latin and Greek. They were very well educated. They read all of the, Roman and Greek history, so they understood good and bad. During the Constitutional Convention, they endeavored to create a republic. And Madison called it's a republic of republics because there was a fight, of course, over states' rights versus federal rights. And the agreement was a compromise that the government would have a federal part and it would have state parts, and they each had different authorities. The
Mhm.
Constitution says the federal government has A, B, C, D authority. Everything else the states have. So it was a compromise. But when we started out, we were very close to the Roman Republic. And let me explain that. So, House of Representatives was like the assembly, and the Roman people voted like the Greeks did. So, that part wasn't the same. But the senators originally were named by the states. So, each state, they actually picked their senator. Public didn't vote on it. And the president was picked by the states through the electors. Okay, so there's only one part of the government that was publicly elected. And also, and you may not know this, but you had to be a landowner when the Constitution was enacted because if you weren't a landowner, you couldn't vote. This is
Oh,
just
yeah.
like Rome. So
Yep.
it's called a democracy, which is a form of government where only landholders can vote. Gradually, these parts of the Roman Republic were peeled off and we became more democratic. Senators got publicly elected in 1913. Probably by 1850 or 1860, almost all the states had eliminated the ownership requirement to vote. And of course, then the public at one point got to pick the electors by voting as opposed to the electors picking the president directly. So
Sure.
we became more democratic. I mean, there's several ways we could go with this discussion. I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is the fact that our elections are almost totally corrupt
Yeah.
because they're controlled by the billionaires.
Yep.
I mean, the primary system was created by Democrats because they thought it would be more fair.
Hmm.
Because the idea of the picking a candidate in a smoke-filled room seemed corrupting. Now it's just corrupting in different clothes
Yeah.
because the billionaires fund the candidates, and then during the campaign, I mean, they fund their nomination and then they fund their election.
Yep.
And there's a very scary statistic I have in my book that if you spend the most money, if you're running against somebody else, you spend more money than they do, you have a 90% chance of being elected. Very scary, because that means that the votes are coming from people's impression about who's a better person based on the ads they're watching. Horrible.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a whole lot of election reform that could be done. I mean, I don't know if you know anything about the English election, but or UK, their whole campaign takes 6 weeks,
Wouldn't that
and
be great?
it does. There's no funding. If everybody in Britain joins the party of their choice and pays party dues, and that money goes to the candidates. So all this like millions and millions of dollars and months of wasted time and money aren't there.
When did that concept start? When did the concept of like the smear campaigns and the all these political ads that you would see, when did those start? Because I know when we would cover cases in, I want to say, the early to mid 1800s, that's when you would have people that would get them to vote for multiple candidates. Like they would change their clothes and like send them to another
Yeah.
like voter place and have them vote for whoever that they wanted them to vote for. But when did the smear campaign start?
Well, they really started. I mean, there's a book I have that describes the Gilded Age. There's another name for the Gilded Age, it's the name of the book and I'm forgetting. During the
Sure.
Gilded Age, politics were completely corrupt because somebody stood next to you while you're voted and influenced who you were voting for,
Mhm.
and would take you out for a shot of whiskey after you're done if you're voting for their candidate. Very
Yep.
corrupt.
Mhm.
And so that got cleaned up, and this is one of the great, if not the greatest accomplishments of the progressive movement, was to clean up elections and to clean up corruption in city government, like the Boss Tweed whole thing in New York. They cleaned all that up, but they found people in elected officials, the president and others, like Teddy Roosevelt, was an avid progressive. There were people in authoritarian positions who could make that happen, and they were responding to the public's desire to have things change. Then things got cleaned up, and I don't know when to say. I mean, I think they got the way they are now, maybe when Obama was president. I'm not sure because I don't remember. But I mean, I always laugh because the ads now are only smear ads.
Yeah.
So I don't even watch any political ads anymore because
No.
they're useless. I
Yeah.
mean, I think back in the early aughts, like when Bush was running or something, I think there would be ads that would talk positive about a candidate. He passed this and he passed this and he's for this. That's
Yep.
gone.
Yeah.
And I remember farther back than that when it was really legitimate. Now, social media changed everything.
Mhm.
Social media helped corrupt traditional media because there's no filter there.
Yeah.
And 25 years ago, if you wanted to give a crackpot scheme to the world, you had to get on a soapbox in a park and yell it out, and a few people would hear it.
Yep.
Now you can not only can you do that now and have millions of people see it, you're going to get enhanced for that whatever rant where whoever made it, because you're going to get more eyeballs or ears attuned to it, and that benefits the platform.
Yep.
So, and that corrupt. I mean, and then the 24-hour news thing too. 24-hour
Yep.
news made it so. there's too much time than there is news, so we got to start making stuff up.
Yep.
And then also, journalism degraded.
Yep.
Journalism is very left oriented. There's a chart in my book, I think it's in the 5th book, that shows that I think 60% of the professional journalists who have a journalism degree don't agree that both sides have to be presented on an issue.
Hmm.
You could present one side and you're good. In other words, you
That's
don't, I mean,
interesting.
it used to be, you hear about a story, you're going to write up that story and you fact check it.
Yep.
And then you always find 2 sources that will verify the validity of the story. Then you can write about it. That's basic reporting.
Yep.
But that doesn't happen anymore.
But now it's more like opinion think pieces are considered reporting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We kind of talked about it, but what do you think the future of democracy looks like? And in what ways does it kind of mirror the history of the country that we've already seen? Because everything in history is kind of cyclical, right? Like everything's
Right.
kind of, it's happened and now it's happening again. So, based off where we're at right now, where do you think the future of democracy is going to go? Or where do you hope it goes?
Yeah. Well, it's 2 different answers, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I hope it gets fixed. I mean, we have to get tribalism fixed. In my tribalism book, and usually when I'm on a podcast, people ask me, "Well, what did you say is the answer?"
Yeah.
And I suggested 3 answers in that book. One is fatigue. People get tired of arguing about stupid stuff, and then they quit arguing. Number 2 is some large event, example 9/11, which I don't wish happens, because that would instantly unite the country.
Yep.
Number 3 is that people will realize that communicating is important and start at the grassroots. And since both parties have moderates that are sort of in the middle, those should be the places that should start communicating to try and fix this. I'm always kind of critical of the left because there's some traditional Democrats who are very good people and moral people and have moderate views that are quiet, and they're letting the radicals dictate what their party believes. And to me, they're not complaining or fighting against them. There's some of that now, reaction against the election, but to me, the moderate left holds the keys because they could start communicating with the moderate right and help get rid of tribalism. Without getting rid of tribalism, we can't change the government. We have to be united
Hmm.
because small groups cannot change the system.
The elite control that is currently taking place, what does that mean for the American public as a whole? And how has that sort of control changed over the years? Did I already kind of ask you this question?
Kind of, but you said it, you twisted it in a very good way, because I had to say something very important about billionaire control. I said that the 2 things they're interested in is enriching themselves and protecting their money by having a stable society.
Sure.
Well, a stable society is good for all the people,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
So if they're going to promote that and they're going to suppress dissent and the society is stable, we're all good, at least from that respect.
Yep.
Okay. But the other thing, so the keys to me, and I wrote this in the book, the keys to happiness are still things like freedom.
Hmm.
They don't have really any intention of taking our freedom away. I mean, you could say they sort of do if they manipulate the money we pay in taxes in a way that exerts their control and makes them rich. It hurts us, but
Hmm.
they don't come to our house. They don't bother us. They
Hmm.
don't tend to surveil us. We can still live our lives. We can make out of our lives what we want. There's still
Hmm.
freedom. And freedom is a very fundamental thing to Americans. It's in our DNA.
Hmm.
And if they ever did attack our freedom, which the globalist system might do, there would be a reaction. I mean, there are
Hmm.
going to be people who form their own armies and stuff like that because they're not going to tolerate that.
Yep.
So we keep enough of what we value that is still valuable. I mean, the groups that are hurt though are the disadvantaged, and I mean like lower intelligence people who don't have education, so they don't have access to good jobs, and so they're subject to the whims of lower wage job availability,
Mm-hmm.
basically. And
Yep.
because with the billionaire control, and I didn't mention this, the wealth gap is growing,
Yes.
and everybody talks about that. So the poor are getting poorer, and the rich are getting richer,
Yep.
and it's mostly the rich are getting richer. Because if you own property or you have investments, as you know, they can grow faster than any other method of increasing wealth.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, even if you have a PhD or something like that, no matter what your skill level is, you can't raise your income enough to compete with how someone could grow their income if they have property
Yep.
or investments. And that's what happened during the 2009 crash. You know, the elites lost 20% or 30% or whatever, everybody did, but then theirs bounced back because as soon as the stock market recovered, they got all their money back, but the people that lost their homes didn't.
Yep. In your opinion, do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better?
No, I think it's already as worse as bad as it can get.
Okay.
But I mean, what makes, and I'm glad you asked that, because what makes this election interesting is never before has one party or the other run on a radical platform. And the reason they never did is because you couldn't get elected. I mean, the standard operating procedure in politics is you get nominated based on your ideology,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get elected based on moving to the center. So you
Yep.
start adopting policies that are more moderate during the fall campaign in order
Mm-hmm.
to get votes, because there's a very large number of Americans who are in the middle.
Yep.
And we haven't brought this up in our discussion at all. The public has a big responsibility in this, the voting public, because they don't study the candidates. The fact that the country's tribal makes it easy to join a tribe. Hey, I'll just pick the tribe that kind of thinks like me. And then
Yep.
you're in the echo chamber, and you don't have to think anymore because you just mimic what your tribe believes. Not
Yep.
good.
Yeah.
So people have to be responsible. And another example is everybody complains that we want to throw out all those old people in Congress, okay? But
Yep.
when it comes down to voting, they want to keep their person because they like them, and they want everybody else to throw out their person. And then
Yep.
nobody throws out anybody. I mean, the public still has a lot of power if they're willing to exercise it. They could cancel out everybody that's over 65 if they wanted. Just vote against them. But they have to be organized and ready to do that. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to attack the incumbent in the primaries. Because if two Democrats are running together, you'd vote for the person who's young and new. If you wait till the general, then you got to vote against your party, and you're not going to do that.
Yep.
So there needs to be a strategy.
As we sort of kind of wrap up the interview, like in regards to your latest book, what are things that we haven't covered that you really want our listeners to know about it and about kind of the power dynamics that are going on sort of behind the scenes, but not really behind the scenes when it comes to the government?
I don't know. We touched on most of it. I mean, the theme of the book is, first of all, it's called America's Counterfeit Democracy because I define democracy and talk about how it changes. Like I talked about our democracy when it started. Now, the founders never called it a democracy, they called it a republic. And
Mm-hmm.
nowhere in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence is the word democracy.
Yep.
Somebody added that later, and we all call it that because it's convenient. And maybe we don't understand what a republic is,
Yep.
but we really have a republic. So there is a famous man, Robert Dahl, who is historically the world's leading expert on analyzing democracies. And he created a system to analyze democracies that you can apply across the world. It's a rating system. Every country gets a rating.
Sure.
And our country has slipped. We were, I think, 17th, and we're now like down to 39th or something since 2005. And the reason is because our government is not functional and there's too much factionalism. So this is really the tribal thing. I mean, do you realize that other countries are not tribal? They're not, they don't have this tribalism thing. I mean, they have opposition parties. A lot of them have multiple parties. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just A against B, it's party against party. And of course, the parliamentary system is a lot cleaner than what we have,
Sure.
because there's constitutional monarchies and constitutional democracies in Europe, and the leader of the party is the prime minister. So there's
Yep.
no separate president being elected, and it's cleaner. And they have multiple parties. Anyway, but we're falling short in terms of our definition of democracy. And again, the main thing is the increasing influence of billionaires in terms of control of wealth and control of public opinion. There's hope in podcasts. There's hope in what you're doing. It's a great thing. This is like my 34th podcast this year or something. And I
Wow.
think it's a great venue
Mm-hmm.
because every podcaster has a group of followers. And when you get interesting guests on, it just proliferates the ideas
Mm-hmm.
and people understand. I mean, I told you before that I started writing because I want to help the public understand politics.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't do it if you read academic publications because they're not at the level that the public understands.
Correct. Yeah.
So I try to explain things in ways the public will understand, and hopefully some readers of mine will be better because they read my books.
Sure. I would agree. We need that. We need somebody who can distill the information in a way that makes sense to the general public, because I feel that the general public, not as a whole, but a large subset of it, just doesn't understand
Right.
anything having to do with the government.
Look at those interviews. They'll stop people on the street in New York and say, well, sometimes people don't know who the president is, but most people know that. And they'll say, like, what are the three branches of government? No clue. And if
Yep.
you don't know that, you don't know how laws are made or anything. It's sad. In
Yeah.
history, I mean, in defense of the public, in this case, history has always been taught wrong. I
Yeah.
mean, I could say that about when I took it because they try to cram too many things, like to do total American history in one semester or two semesters is
Yeah.
wrong. And all you're doing is learning dates and names that don't mean anything.
Yep.
Real history is much more interesting.
Yep.
And when you take important events in history and you read about them, you remember them, you understand what their implications are.
I would agree. I did not enjoy history when I was in school. It wasn't
Right.
until later when I was able to sit and actually digest it and consume it the way that I wanted to consume it that I started
Yeah.
being like, oh, yeah, history is actually really interesting. I would like to thank Michael for joining me today. And kind of before we go, can you tell our listeners where they can find you online or anything else that you would like them to know?
Well, I'm easy to find. It's MikeAndersonsBooks.com. So that's Anderson with an S and books with an S. That's my author site. It's got my books there and a story about my books. You can order the books from there. My Substack is available there. I have a blog also. My ancient history blog is there. And so you can really learn anything about me. I have podcasts up there also, previous podcasts. So that's the place to start.
Sounds great. And on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay, and I'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.